Tuesday morning, I had expected to see an old friend of mine stop by with a Malibu. He had messaged me and asked for a little bit of help getting the ignition timing set, and I told him to bring it by. So I got out my timing light and hooked it up, set the ignition timing for him, and then diagnosed another problem. So I showed him how I cured this problem on Vicky's C10 with a one-wire alternator and sent him into jigs to pick up what they needed. Then it was time to get started on the Malibu. I want to get this intake manifold swapped out. So me and Kenny put the car up on the lift, slid a bucket underneath of it, and started draining the radiator. And we began the process of removing the intake. I've pondered over this decision to swap this intake quite a bit over the last couple of days, and I feel pretty confident we're doing the right thing. The new Team G intake has a port in the back of it that I can plumb the power brakes and the PCV valve to, which will be a welcome change so that I don't have to worry about putting the vacuum lines underneath this carburetor anymore. Anyways, Kenny's pulling this intake manifold off. I'm kind of excited to see what the intake runners look like after this carburetor gasket debacle the day before. So I shine a light down the intake runners and everything looks fine. The valve stems and the intake runners are perfectly clean. So the next step is to lay some paper towels down in the intake valley and start removing the old intake gaskets and the silicone on the end rails. Kenny digs through my secret stash of gaskets and finds one brand new pair of Felpro 1206s ready to go. By this time, everybody was getting a little bit hungry, so Kenny ran down to the gas station and brought back a pizza for everybody, while Vicky and Harlie worked on answering emails and getting orders ready for the next week's shipment of merchandise. And so it was perfect timing when my parts guy from A1 Auto Parts stopped by with my heater hose fittings and vacuum tees to hook up my power brakes and everything on this new intake. And of course, he had to take a few minutes to say hi to Chivy while he's here. He's the guy that Chivy goes to immediately as soon as she comes through the door when we go to A1 to beg for dog treats and belly rubs. So anyway, while we're finishing up lunch, Uncle Bucko is up at the farm working on Dad's John Deere A. Evidently, the clutch started to come apart while he was plowing the field with it yesterday. So Jeremy works on the Deere, gets it apart, and then he starts degreasing my dump truck.
You're trying to get something done.
Evidently, someone had run over the garden hose up at the farm, so he had to run into the hardware and pick up a new one so he could use the power washer to blow all the grease and debris off this engine before he starts taking it apart. Meanwhile, back at the shop, me and Kenny are just about ready to start putting the Malibu back together. I had Kenny go ahead and put a little bit of silicone on the cylinder heads, put the intake gaskets on the heads, and let the silicone set up so that we don't have to worry about the intake gaskets moving when we bolt the intake back on the engine. All right, Kenny Powers, you ready to learn something today? Yep. A man of few words. So do you understand what we're up to here, Kenny Powers?
Switching intakes.
Yeah, but do you know why we're switching intakes?
You're getting too much air.
No, that's not true. Although that's an overgeneralization. So what we are trying to do here is correct a port velocity issue. So let's take some measurements here real quick. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is compare our Edelbrock Super Victor intake, which is not ported, it's out of the box, with this old school Team G small block Chevy single plane intake. And the first thing we're going to do is take some measurements off the port width and height at the intake gasket opening. Now this is the Super Victor, and its port opening is 1.169. Okay, that's the width. So let's measure the Team G. Now this is right out of the box. The Team G is bigger. 1199 to 12.0. Okay, so port width, the little Team G is actually bigger than the Super Victor. That's a little bit interesting. I wouldn't have expected that. So let's measure this way for our port height at the intake gasket. And we have 1.998, just under 2 inches. Let's measure the Team G. Oh, a lot bigger. 2059. So believe it or not, this little Team G intake manifold that's actually intended to be used on mild street applications. Has a larger port width and height at the intake gasket than the Edelbrock 2925 Super Victor. Now here's the big difference. I'm a little bit surprised that this intake is bigger at the intake manifold gasket than the race manifold, this being a mild street application single plane, this being a full race deal. Now I'm sure that they've left this one small in order for people to have more room to port them and alter the flow of the air as it comes down and meets the intake gasket. I'm sure that's the reason that it's that way, but I'm comparing out of the box to out of the box. So far we have a larger port at the gasket with a Team G, but in the plenum, this is my concern. If you look at how big and ginormous these intake runners are below the carburetor as it enters the plenum compared to the little Team G. Now keep in mind the Team G is larger at the gasket than the Edelbrock, but the Edelbrock is ginormous as the ports enter the plenum underneath the carburetor compared to the Team G. Now what that does is this large port on the Edelbrock, the larger the ports are right here in the plenum, the slower the air velocity, okay? The smaller they are, like this one, the higher the air velocity. Overall less CFM with the Team G. But at lower RPM and smaller cubic inch, this intake will work better on a 355, mild 355, especially like this, than this one. So what happens is when we're up 7,000 RPM and we're making our shift from first to second gear, your port volume and your volumetric efficiency and your port velocity is high. But when you hit second gear and you hit high gear, you slow down that port velocity, the air going through those intake runners, and it kills signal to the carburetor. Whereas on this intake manifold, this one is more tuned in the RPM range that we're looking for and on the cubic inch displacement that we're using. A little bit surprised that the Team G is actually nicer size to a 1206 intake gasket out of the box than the Edelbrock. It's actually larger at the gasket. But in the intake plenum, these ports are much, much smaller. Also, the Team G has this really nice feature of it has a vacuum port drilled and tapped right into the back of the plenum so that we can run our power brakes and our PCV valve right out of the intake, whereas the big Super Victor doesn't have that because you're not going to use power brakes and PCV valves usually on an application that this intake is intended to be used on. So this is going to be really nice because we can get rid of those vacuum lines that hook to the base plate of the carburetor that are such a pain in the butt to deal with every time you want to pull the carburetor off. The other thing is the overall height difference of these two intake manifolds is, well, let's measure it. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure off the intake manifold flange that seals the front edge of the lifter valley. Okay, you can't just measure off the bottom because that bottom may not be the same dimension, but this dimension has to be on the two intakes where the intake manifold meets the block and seals the lifter valley. So we've got us a straight edge, and we're going to take a measurement here, and we've got just under 4 inches, 3 15/16 on that one. And on this intake, oh, we have 5 and, wow, that's 5 9/16, 5 5/8, 5 5/8. So this intake, the carburetor is quite a bit higher than the Team G. But what I would like to do is use this tapered spacer on top of the nitrous plate. And what these spacers are intended to do is increase air velocity through the booster of the carburetor. And I could have bought the taller Team G. They make one that's like an inch taller, but I elected to use this one for one, hood clearance, but two, I wanted to get the carburetor down lower into the plenum, and I wanted to be able to use one of these HVH spacers on top of the nitrous plate, which the nitrous plate's laying over there. We'll show that here in a minute when we put it back together. But ultimately, I think this is going to give us much better low-end torque, mid-range power, and I don't think it's going to affect the top end of the RPM range at all. But I think in mid-range, where we're making our gear changes, I think this intake and this spacer is going to make a vast improvement over this Super Victor, at least on this engine and this combination. So before we set the intake down on the car, I go ahead and mock everything up and make sure we have the correct length carburetor studs. Then I turn Kenny Powers loose with bolting the intake down on the small block. It didn't take him long, and the intake matches perfect to the gaskets and the cylinder heads. Next up, we set the nitrous plate on and the carburetor spacer, and I was just about ready to bolt down the thermostat housing when Uncle Bucko showed up to pay us a visit. Before I put this intake back together, I wanted to make sure I drilled a couple steam holes in the thermostat. So I took care of that, and then we put the distributor down in with the engine on number 1 top dead center, and then bumped it over till the distributor dropped in, and then it was time to put the plug wires on and finally top the cooling system off with water. Once we had all that done, I had Kenny crank the engine over to fill the carburetor bowls up with gas, and then we can check for fuel leaks and prime the accelerator pumps. Then it's time to hit the key, hook the timing light up, set the ignition timing, and get ready to go for a test drive. I quickly make a few minor adjustments to the idle speed and the idle mixture screws and start dialing everything in. I double check the ignition timing, check for leaks one more time, and we top off the cooling system after the thermostat opens. After that, it's finally time to put this thing into the wind out on the road and see how it runs. The throttle response and the throttle feel is vastly improved over what it once was. Immediately upon hitting the throttle, the Malibu knocked the tires off of it, but as I hit second gear, I could clearly tell this thing is much happier at the gear change. Now there's only one thing left to do. Take it down to the test spot, foot brake it, and see how it runs. Now I figure since we're about 2 days away from bringing Kenny's Camaro back home, it would be a good time to teach Harlie how to back everybody up and pour puddles. And she did a fantastic job for the first time ever doing this out on the street. I was really proud of her. Miss Harlie,
Yes.
what did you think about pouring puddles today?
It was fun.
It was
nerve-wracking.
the first time you've ever done that, right?
First time.
Ever.
Ever.
You knocked it out of the park,
Just watched.
right?
But I did good.
You did good. You backed me right in my tracks. You poured the puddles just right. You pulled me up into the puddles. You're going to be a pro. That way when Kenny Powers gets to racing, he's got a freaking trained team member. It's going to happen, Kenny Powers.
Yep, should be pouring my puddles.
Excited.
All right, everybody, welcome back. So we've been working on the Malibu a little bit tonight. I'm still tweaking and tuning a little bit on this thing, trying some different ignition timing with this new intake, trying different jetting, trying different pump cams and squirter setups, and I'm getting really close. I'm almost happy with it, but it's got to be perfect or else I'm not happy. But I'm really ecstatic about this intake because it pulls through the gear changes a lot better. I say that, but we'll take it to the track, and when you watch, it'll go slower or something. That's my luck. Anyway, I took it down tonight and put a little pump gas in it. It seems to run just fine on pump gas. I've been running it on race gas because I was spraying it and I wasn't really sure where the ignition timing was, and I was trying to be safe, but I think I've rectified the timing pointer. I went ahead and made some adjustments to it tonight and used a stop in the number 1 spark plug hole and adjusted the timing pointer so I know where my timing's at now. So I think it's set right now at about 40 degrees. So anyway, I had a little problem at the gas station. Freaking Scrappy. Come here. Hey, Scrap. Scrap. Come here. Come on. Hey, come here. Come on. I know you don't like the Malibu. Oh, Scrap. She's scared to death, this Malibu, and she got in it. But then when I stopped the gas station, I opened the door and she jumped out and was trucking. I had to carry her and put her back in the Malibu. That crazy dog. I love her to death, but boy, I'll tell you what, she is not a fan of the Malibu whatsoever. Oh yeah, and I was just thinking of this. I was thinking of it at the gas station, actually. When I was putting gas in this thing, every time I show a video of me putting gas in it down to BP, everybody says, "You're putting diesel in it. The green pump is diesel." No, it's not. So you don't have to worry, guys. I definitely didn't put diesel fuel in my Malibu. So moving on, I have this to put in the car this week. My anti-scatter gas car kit for my 10-bolt rear end. This is an NOS Mini Progressive Controller, and the part number is 25974 NOS. And like I mentioned the other day, I've had these in Tommy's truck, and actually I've had it in Billy's truck when Billy's truck was on nitrous years ago. So I've got a lot of experience with this little controller. It's a really handy little guy. It's only 200 bucks at Jegs. And so the idea is to put this thing on so that I can just go off the wide open throttle switch and not have to use the button when I'm trying to go fast. And I can actually ramp the nitrous in and soften the hit a little bit. That makes it easier on the rear end. But I can also delay the nitrous hit and turn it on a gear change, or I can do whatever I want with this controller. So I think tomorrow, or maybe one day this week, I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow yet, but maybe tomorrow or one day this week, I'll do an unboxing video with the controller, and I'll install the controller and I'll get it all set up, and maybe we'll go out and do a little playing around with some spray. I know that I think Kill Care runs a test and tune on Thursday, so it is a consideration of mine to take this thing down there Thursday night and test it at Kill Care with the nitrous turned on, and just see what it does with this new intake on motor, and then we'll hit some nitrous and just see what it does. But I think we can definitely run low 11s without breaking the rear end that way. And I'm still on the lookout for a rear end for this thing. To be honest, I'm kind of leaning towards a 12-bolt. And the reason is they're a little bit lighter and they use less power to turn them. And I'm kind of wanting to just keep this thing GM. I don't really want any Ford parts in my Malibu. You know what I mean? Not that it's a big deal, but there's a Ford rear end in the 55 and Ford rear end in Tommy's S10 back here, and a Ford rear end in the Billy's S10. We've had good luck with them. I have no problem with them. But this one, kind of wanting to keep it all GM. But beggars can't be choosers. It just depends on what deal comes up when, and I'm still interested maybe a 8.5 10-bolt out of Grand National. That's still an option. I just haven't found the right deal on one yet. I think I'm having trouble going through emails because I get so many emails and I get backed up, and sometimes I just don't get back to everybody like maybe I should. But if you've got a 8.5 10-bolt, keep emailing me. Hopefully I'll see it. And the ones I look at always seem to have an attachment. Like if you've got one and you send a picture and a price all at one time, and I don't have to spend an hour texting or messaging back and forth, that helps me tremendously, because my time is very limited to go through emails and mess around on the computer. But I'm still interested in one. If you guys got one out there, keep trying to hit me with it. I may find one and get a decent deal on one. I did have one guy message me, said he had one, he'd sell it at a decent price, but he wanted my rear end out of this, which I'm not sure why, but I just don't want to give up the original rear end of the Malibu. Even though it's not much, it is the original rear end of this car, and I just don't want to let go of it. So, also, it almost skipped my mind. I got a reminder tonight from Miss Vicky that we're supposed to give that little 124 scale 32 Ford Coupe signed by Paul Matt. It's still in here. We're still selling entries on it. I forgot all about it, to be quite honest with you, but Vicky reminded me tonight. So I think that's Wednesday, tomorrow. Oh God. So I think that's going to happen maybe tomorrow night. We got to give that thing away. So if you still want to get some entries, go to theoldmansgarage.shop and you can buy your armbands on there. And I think Vicky and Miss Harlie are planning on doing something with that tomorrow night. I told them we're going to do it live. So hopefully we're ready. I think that's just about everything. Look forward to the NOS Mini controller install maybe this week. And maybe a little test and tune Thursday with the Malibu. We'll take it out and see if we can't set another personal record. That's going to be tough, because that 149 60 foot I made with it at Edgewater, I'm not sure if I want to try that trick again. Not with this rear end. I don't want to break anything else, at least in the near future. Anyway, I'm going to hop off here tonight, guys. Remember, get your entries in for the Paul Lamette autographed 32 Ford American Graffiti car if you're still interested in getting in on that. See y'all maybe tomorrow. Good night, everybody.